Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'll give everybody a few minutes to get in, but really excited to be talking to these amazing experts. I believe they're all in Europe. They're both in Europe at the moment, but that changes at any point of the week, day, moment. Very blessed to have Alix Rubsaam agree to join us today, and Alix is the head of curriculum at Singularity Group, and she's also a researcher in philosophy of technology, so has a plethora of input and gathers resources from all over the planet. And Wolfgang Fengler, who's the lead economist with the World Bank, and he's also founder of World Data Lab, and an amazing tool that he will hopefully show us how to use shortly. But welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, morning, wherever it is that you are in the world.
Thank you so much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I love the way, Alix, you always say yes, and Wolfgang, you always say yes, so very grateful from our perspective. So I'm going to launch straight into the questions. We are out at quarter to the next hour, so I'd love to know just a bit of background. And Alix, I'll go to you first. Where did your interest in data actually begin? Why did you become so involved with it?
Yeah, for sure. So, well, my background is in humanities, right? So I studied literature, cultural analysis, and philosophy. And so all of that sort of pivoted towards technology during my undergrad. And I was really looking at sort of the way in which how we engage, how we culturally and socially situate our technologies really impact how they work and how they sort of what effects they have on the world around us in return. And one of the things I found quite early on is like, so my particular interest has always been around AI and robotics being sort of these technologies that we project a lot of our wants and needs and desires onto. And of course, for AI, the most crucial part of it is, you know, the motor behind it really is the data. And that really, to me, is a parallel to, for me, how the way that we operate with our technology shapes our technologies. Similarly, the way that we collect, organize, ask questions of our data really shapes the way that our data-driven technologies function. So the conditions under which we collect data, the questions we specifically ask to get to data points are so crucially important when it comes to what effects we sort of get from them, but they're often not as visible, right? We talk a lot about AI being a black box, but really what's the first part of that sort of mystification of those technologies is really what questions were asked, what were the conditions of collection, stuff like that, that really shapes, but is really quite invisible for a lot of us. So that's been a real sort of interest for me to look into, like, well, how does that shape what we get out of these technologies?
I love that, because I think the questions are crucial. I often do surveys and I go, what mood am I in? Which situation am I in? Am I answering this from the perspective of a colleague, a mother, a friend? You know, what perspective am I actually answering these questions from? So I love that you said that. Wolfgang, where did your interest in data originate?
Yeah, maybe I'll tell it through a story, which is when I lived in Kenya, and you know, the World Bank as economists, to deal with data, or at least to deal with numbers. And I had to organize for our chief economist, Justin Lin, at that time, a lunch. And there was one of the guests was actually the CEO of Safaricom. You may know Safaricom, especially through mobile money and M-Pesa. And that was 2009, so a long time ago. And then there was a lot of talk about telecoms and, you know, market share. And then I moderated the session. I asked the last question, says, Michael, what's the next frontier in that space? And then he responded and said, data is the next frontier. And everybody around the table says, this guy must be crazy. You know, how can you make money with data? And why is data and telecoms related? So it was like just head shaking there. And so here we are 13 years later, and we have these webinars and all talk about it. So it's also good to realize how things do change, and maybe how some people were foresightful, others weren't. But then I got obviously interested in some things that you referred to, because I looked at many numbers and data, and I looked at especially Africa and how it transforms. And I have a particular soft spot for demography. And then I noticed something that was just going against the tide, because everybody's talking still about the population bomb. And I looked at the numbers and said I couldn't find, you know, this population bomb directly, because actually number of children per family is going down quite dramatically. but we still get many more people. So that paradox tried to uncover. And then I did some of these playful games around demography and tried to create its own narrative and created a blog at Brookings that came with that. But just to help them, you use numbers. For me, data and number are still quite interchangeable bit in a way to look at the world in a new way. And that's then led to many other things, including World Data Lab.
Which is quite fascinating, and we'll get into that shortly. So data's being collected at the moment in every move we make, in every purchase we make, every medical checkup we have, and in a multiplicity of other ways. Every time I speak about a brand or a product, you know, the next thing I know on one of my social media accounts, I'm getting ads popping up around that particular topic. Is it being used to maximize for positive outcomes? And then yes, no. How do we ensure moving forward that we do the best job we can in ensuring that we use it for positive outcomes? Alix, I'll go to you again first.
Well, to me, the short answer for the first question is no, not enough, right? I think, I think there's a couple of problems with the way that data is currently being used and collected. One of them being like we're seeing massive concentrations of wealth and power in where that's collected, right? And this is, for example, what I find interesting about Wolfgang's work is like that's a counter example of someone, you know, doing it on their own, using and building that data set for the exact purposes that it's being built on. I think one of the biggest pitfalls that we're seeing currently is we have a number of like huge players in the market that are collecting data as if it's all, and then selling that data, right, to be used by different people. And so regardless of what whoever buys that data is using it for, again, the collection of that data, the questions that were being asked, the conditions under which they were collected, like you mentioned as well, is sort of centralized, and then it's passed on as if it's neutral, as if it's culture independent, etc. So I think in that sense, that's a huge pitfall for me in how we think about what we do with the data. After that is just part of the question, right? And so what I'd like to see is to empower users, businesses to build out processes by which to collect their own data rather than purchasing and reusing data. That to me is a sort of a way in which we can be, and so the risks associated with not doing that, right, is of course those of sort of inequity, unfairness. What we're seeing a lot in, we often hear about algorithmic bias, of course, but really in most, well, there's different ways in which algorithmic bias can come about, but what we hear most about is biases in the data set, right? And so that's at the moment of collection before we even, and so before we even get to the part where an AI is involved, is just really like, is this a representative data set? What we saw with facial recognition software being trained on predominantly white and male faces, the work that Joy Bolamwini is doing, seeing really that the discrepancies in accuracy of facial recognition software go back all the way to the data. And these are, in most cases, generalized data sets that are being used. So we're seeing the repercussions of data sets being considered too sort of like value neutral and culturally neutral in that space. The repercussions of that are unfairness down the line, right? And so that to me is a big challenge when it comes to, if we want to do good with our data, if we want to, we will have to make sure that the collection is happening, that the training, that the data sets that we used are all the way at the very beginning, before we even decide what to do with it, that those are made under equitable and fair circumstances.
So a few years ago now at a Singularity use summit, I think it was in California, I've been to amazing summits around the world from Singularity, and they're all amazing. So sometimes I can't remember where I heard the information, but I heard the comment that said that in order to get the bias out of the algorithm, it would need to be rewritten by a machine 1,000 times. That may have been an exaggeration at the time, or maybe not. What are we up to with that? Just before I get Wolfgang to answer that question, because I know you do a lot of work in algorithmic bias, and it's a fascinating topic. But how far down the track do we need to go before the algorithmic bias is minimal?
First and foremost, I disagree. I think it's very important to realize there is no such thing as a bias-free algorithm. An algorithm per definition is biased. If you have an algorithm that needs to identify squares from circles, then it has a bias towards squares. And so I think that's one of the things when we, in public discourse around sort of the problems around algorithmic bias, you see a lot of people having this as a goal, right? We're going to go towards a bias-free algorithm. That's fundamentally not a thing we can do. What I think is important, and why I would say we need humans and sort of these circumstances under which these algorithms operates in the loop, right, is because of the fact that biases are always present. I think what happens when we let AI do all of that, we just obscure the biases that are there. My favorite example in this space is there was a hiring algorithm, not the Amazon one. It's in a book, Data Feminism, that came out 2 years ago, where they had a hiring algorithm they self-audited to look at what are the most important characteristics that our hiring algorithm is looking for. And it turned out those characteristics were that someone was called Jared and that they play lacrosse. Now, what that meant in North America, which is where this example was from, is that this is an algorithm that's implicitly coding for white males, right? And you need a cultural understanding, you need a human cultural perspective to be able to identify that. That to me is where that collaboration is necessary. So when it comes to eliminating biases that may come from the data set, as in this case is the case, right? So this algorithm, which was a self-learning algorithm, figured out because it wasn't optimizing for ethnicity, it wasn't optimizing for gender, that it found different ways in which the preferences in the data set it could find through these characteristics. So it means that we need to take a human look at what's happening in our data set and not trying to eliminate bias, but sort of look at what are the biases that we're looking for. In case of hiring, it might be like relevant experience, right? And a skill set that matches the job you're looking for. Those are biases as well, but they're appropriate ones, they're legal ones. And so that takes a sort of human collaboration and human perspective onto that data set that we use to train that stuff.
I'm so happy I asked that question because, yeah, thank you for answering that. So Wolfgang, back to you. Is it being used for maximum positive outcomes?
No, I'd love to build on an Alix because I think that set the stage very nicely, and you can have the, think of some complementarities. Obviously, we'll talk a lot more about the risks, but first, the opportunities are not exploited. Even though we have so much data, there's not enough people who make sense of the data. And I think that is the industry and analytics, you can call it analytics, but analytics should be simple, not complicated. And so I think one should think of data in a granular way so that we have now capacity to go into every village in real time. But also forward-looking and global. So that's, I think, the key things. Some people love history, me too, but most people actually want to know what's in the future, which singularity is about. So those are always my filters I think you can use. Now let's use an example that's very, where we think, and that's the one you referred to, Christina, we already have too much data. But I'll show you examples where actually data is used not in the right way. And this is doesn't necessarily have evil forces behind, but just wrong statistics. So if you have Facebook example of how many customers, say L'Oreal could have in Australia, then among teenagers or among millennials, they may give you a number that's actually more than the total number of millennials in South Africa, in Australia. That's obviously easy to check for everybody. But if you go into some sub-segments, then you still could find the error not as easily, but you can find it. But this is a simple thing where basically it's actually good to go the opposite, to go zoom out a bit and says, how many people are there actually? How many people are in Australia? How many teenagers or millennials are there? And then how many could be the product? And you get then a number. And that's, I think, logic one should apply, and I'll apply it in a second. But so surprisingly, sometimes maybe this is overcomplicated. We don't need Facebook or all this other stuff. Obviously, they have super granular data, which is what you referred to. Really, where you click, what you like at which point of the day, if you're left-handed, right-handed, all this other stuff. But the aggregations often are not correct. Second, if you take, again, the example you used, Christina, and you click on something, or you go into the supermarket and buy some shampoo, then you will get tracked, and we maybe sometimes want that because we get some bonuses out of this. And don't forget actually that the data we give, actually it's really sold to others. But what's interesting, and I learned this recently, is hypermarkets, so shopping, is mega into data. Discounters are not. The data on discounters is not available because they're very hiding all their data. And there's obviously in Europe, and Alix would know this, German companies, Lidl, Aldi, they don't share it. So people don't really know exactly what's happening. E-commerce is good data, but still people will look. If you want to project how many shampoos you can sell in Romania or in Indonesia through online, not clear projections there. So there's still a lot of space we can actually do, a lot of things we can work to use the opportunities, assuming this is a good thing. I personally think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing if people can go online like we are now. I think it's a good thing if you can reduce transaction costs and create new businesses and give people, small retailers, an opportunity to be part of it. Final point just there where I think the opportunities are massively underused are in health. I would love to be more digitized. I want to have something where I see all my data on my x-rays and everything and reduce my costs when I do my next checkup and have a much easier data-driven way. And now geeks like you have it already somehow, but I don't see my aunt using it. I don't see even my kids using it. We don't have that democratization of data in health because what I think is too much privacy bias here. Even though there's risks to that, I know as well, but the opportunities we are losing in a big way, and people are dying too early because we're not using the opportunities of data in health. And so I think there's still a lot to do to use and reap the opportunities.
It's very, very interesting in the whole health. Yeah, Alix?
Sorry, just one thing you mentioned, Wolfgang, that I think is really important as well is that in this discussion, right, when we talk about data, a lot of it is being sort of sketched or portrayed as if there's like some evil villain, right? Like don't like, ha ha ha, I'll take your data. And in most cases, and I think this really bears repeating, it is just bad statistics is what's causing these problems, right? We see the same with biases, is like if you have a facial recognition software that doesn't work for non-male and non-white faces, that's bad statistics. That's a bad statistical representation of what faces look like. And that's really important to remember. And I think the same goes when it comes to our health data that I completely agree on, is like, if privacy is sorted, right, that's not a data problem, that's a privacy problem, that's a policy problem. And so with that, I agree, there's so many opportunities, and it's often sketched as if there's some like evil megamind holding sort of our data, for when these opportunities are very much there, and the most of the problems associated with them are either just bad statistics problems or policy problems.
Well put.
I love that, the fact that there potentially is no huge mega mind out there trying to do that. Alix, something that you said before that leads me into this next question around data ownership. So at the moment, we willingly willingly or not willingly fill in surveys. People pick up data, it's owned by organizations. And there's been a lot of talk around one day we will get paid individually for our data. Wolfgang, how far away do you think that might be? Do you think it's actually a distinct possibility that we will be controllers of our data? We will be the ones that get the financial reward? And then I go, is there going to be a financial reward for collecting data outside of big multinationals, big companies collecting a database and selling it to someone else? How do you see the future of data collection and ownership of data?
Yeah, excellent question, and I think it's already happening, but it's happening asymmetrically, right? If you have this example, you go to your supermarket, you have your bonus card, and you get some discount, but it's not that that discount just as an illustration. What is interesting, I learned myself recently, these supermarkets are actually selling your data. Not just that they're using it, they're actually literally selling it. So Coca-Cola pays a lot of money to some of these guys. So that itself is something where the asymmetry, if it's resolved, maybe one gets even more. But we have to, you have to quantify it and you have to illustrate it, and then you will have, and I think it's already now that people can do certain types of service and get paid for it partly. But I think the two things that need to happen, one, you still will need, and that comes back to the bad statistics quote from Alix, you need some kind of data spine, which is credible and is robust, and that has, well, and for me, the data spine is quite obvious because it's the number of people in the world. You could also have the number of animals and the number of trees, but let's start with the people, 7.9 billion, and they have certain ages, they have certain characteristics, certain faces, but also certain income and certain life expectancy. You can just start with the fundamentals people can agree on. How long do you live? How do you create more prosperity? And through that, you can do so many modifications. And in that vision, you can say, well, let's have a villager in Papua New Guinea. Maybe he wants to work on the data model for his village. and could get paid for it, because actually the World Bank and others pay quite some good money for surveys, but it's often then piecemeal. You do a study and you go in a book and then nobody reads it. Even sometimes they do. But if you had that more dynamic system, like a puzzle to say, well, that's the world, 7.9 billion people, 250 million in Indonesia, that many in Papua, in Papua or Jayapura, and then the work on your model and you get paid for helps the other model become better. That would be a bit flipping and upside down. But I think we already, it's already happening, but it's happening piecemeal and in a way that people say, yeah, it's still this discount in a supermarket. So maybe Alix has some views on when we really get to a stage that people really get even more monetized, or it's more democratized. Because the key thing there, and I think the key opportunity to close with Christina, is if you get now $10 for 10 minutes of a survey, you may say yes, maybe no. But if somebody in Indonesia gets $2 for a survey, they will definitely say yes. And that has some downsides, but it has a lot of upsides. And it can think makes it just easier to reduce transaction costs for something people are quite willing to integrate in this time where still more prosperity is needed.
And I wonder, do we need to get paid for it, particularly in the health field? If my health data actually assists somebody else with a cure or to come up with a hypothesis around something that needs to be solved, why do I want to get paid for it? It's just this equation that now we've been taught around getting paid or not getting paid for data. Alix, what do you think? Where do you think the future of data ownership, etc., is going?
Well, I actually really like the example that Wolfgang just gave of like a community leader taking that responsibility, right? What I think we see, and this is of course true for many of the exponential technologies that we see across the world, like, yes, there is democratization, yes, there is increased access, but not all of us have the privilege of leisure and education to be able to, become experts. Like, if you look at the way that that our data is being collected, being aware and being able and sort of having the agency, the time, the money, just the effort and the education around being able to stop all of that data being collected, say you wouldn't want to, right? That's not available to everyone. That is a privilege afforded to some of us. And while that's great, that we shouldn't sort of overestimate that ability as somehow being democratized as well. The way in which the world is currently being sort of designed is not in a way that allows that agency to be democratized as well, even though this sort of data sourcing technology has been. So I really like this idea, and I think that can be sort of, and again, my European roots will come shining through, but of community leaders, right? Be they governments, big fan of government, big governments, obviously, saying, okay, we will protect our citizens' data, or smaller community. We had a session with, I forget if you were there, Christina, with the Maori leaders who represent different tribes. We had that at Singularity last year, and they own within their community the responsibility for everyone's data, right? And so there's appointed leaders that do specialize. And this, I think, is a model as well for what we've seen with GDPR, which was sort of like a first step in that direction for community or country leaders taking responsibility for the data of a larger group of people. So as to what I hear often is like this within this space of like, will we own our own data? I think that assumes a level of sort of privilege in our time and our ability to sort of educate, and which is also time, right? To educate ourselves around where our data stream goes, that we shouldn't assume everyone has. And so I like this idea of having appointed leaders that carry responsibility for more people's data than just their own.
And I love the fact about with the community leader. So we did some work a little while ago with some Indigenous elders in Australia, and they've been collecting data for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So when they had a meeting in a particular place where a number of tribes gathered over a period of years, they would actually have mapping sites. And that was a collection of data. So if we collect the data on where pregnant women need to be, on where the young children need to go, on where the elders are going to have a meeting, and it's all put into a mapping site, it's just an example of data collection way back. That was for the benefit of community, not financial gain, which is a lot of the places where it goes now.
Well, and actually that reminds me as well as one of the things that I think is crucially important in how we think about what data is, right? What we consider to be data is actually predicated upon sort of this very specific Western scientific, rather binary definition of what data is, right? What is a fact? What is knowledge? And that is something that is really about 200 years old, right, as a scientific sort of tradition. And so how can we sort of diversify, right, our data sets in the broader sense of the word is just like what counts as knowledge collection, as data collection, and do we have the machinery, do we have the equipment? The answer is no, but because our computers are inherently binary as of yet, to be able to process data that comes in a different format.
And if we go into data as a community asset, as opposed to data as a commercial asset, ethical discussions that need to happen for companies, NFPs, governments, etc. What do you think the crucial aspects of those discussions, the ethical discussions, what needs to be the main point of those? Or is there a main point? Is it a generic discussion to find out exactly how it's going to be used, etc.? Wolfgang, where do you think those discussions need to be directed in the initial stages?
I think the key is again about transparency and overall utility, and you spoke to both of that. And it's important to think of the proper balance. And I'll use again the example we had before, because both extremes are not good. Total privacy with no public use is very unhealthy, and we have it in health. And the opposite, where there's a sense that, as Alix said, algorithms are dominating us and these few big companies are getting just richer, is not healthy either. And we don't really know what's happening. That's so we need to break that both. And for me, the analogy, and later on, I'm happy to do an exercise also with the audience just to get into some real data and it becomes more concrete, but is the health sector, right? And for me, the easiest to think about it is the financial sector, right? So it's very rare that our accounts get hacked and that our accounts are being emptied. Actually, it's very rare, and I'm almost sure it happened to you. It never happened to me, so I'm very happy with that. And so, and that's a good start, yeah. But the data in your bank, it needs to be monitored, and it is not your individual data, Christina or Alix, but it is the bank itself, and then the branch, and they need to make profit, I hope, otherwise you'll be in trouble. But then the total banking system needs to be monitored as well, because otherwise the central bank wouldn't know what to do, and we have a real problem. So it is actually a pretty good system, I think. I have my complete privacy. Nobody, you guys can't look at my account, but the aggregations work so that we can monitor the sector and interest rates can be set. And I wish the same was true for health, that I can access again my health account now, I can check what happened, but that the system, a trusted system that is as robust as in the financial sector, doesn't leak my data from my last checkup, but that, as you said before, Christina, the data can be used for others, your individual data for some other individual, or the aggregations, as we have now experienced in COVID in a different way, that at least there's some tracking. People may have forgotten it wasn't there actually. 2 years ago, there was zero tracking on health. Now at least we see it on the news every day with some estimates. And with that system that is, protects your privacy, but is dynamic and has a capacity to aggregate so that, policymakers, but also the private sector can use it. And there's nothing harm with the private sector to use it if it's within that context that I just outlined. So for me, that's an illustration how one other sector could follow what we have, and then the financial sector has a little of other problems, but that part I think is a good example to follow.
I think that trust and authenticity issue is huge. And I know people, even in the health sector, that have benefited from the research that's been collected by people sharing their data, particularly in cancer research. But I also know somebody who was refused or was charged an absolute premium in health insurance because that data had been shared. Alix, where do you think the ethical discussions need to start with organizations around data?
Well, first and foremost, I don't disagree with Wolfgang, right? I think that is on a policy level, I agree that we need to, and transparency is the key there, right? So from just as a +1 to what Wolfgang has said is like, yes, we need stronger policies, in my opinion, around transparency about what things are used for, how they're used, what's private, what's not. In addition to that, I think one of the, and I know I'm like I come here to spew this message again, but the discrepancies we see in representation in our data set, right? And we see that across industries, across applications, is just a massive underrepresentation of data that is not about white male data sets, right? Is we see that not just in facial recognition, we see that in healthcare data. We know there's a book, what's it called? Invisible Women, I think, by, I'm blanking on the name, but it's really, and it just goes into example after example after example in healthcare as well, and just sort of what we know about the data we have about a white male Northern Hemisphere population is insanely overrepresented if you compare it to any other data set. So that's, and I don't mean to like, we have a lot of data there and we shouldn't not have that data, but there to me is a massive opportunity in terms of ethics, is making sure our data sets are more equitable, and so that we actually get the insights. And again, that is just bad statistics, right? If you look at data on how well different types of medicine perform, we know that, for example, because of women having to menstruate now and then, it's harder to do clinical trials with women. So often they're just eliminated because it's just easier not to do, meaning that what we know in terms of like medicine performance is very often just tested on males because it's just easier because they don't menstruate. Like that, to me, from an ethical perspective, leads to like bad statistics. And we see that, and that's a global trend, right? But we see that repeated, of course, in private organizations in a lot of ways, in just either they buy data sets that haven't considered. There's a beautiful project called I'm going to botch this. I think it's called the Data Nutrition Label, which is a group of people that have sort of developed, like you get on food, like you get that black and white label of like what's in it, how many sort of calories, what kind of carbs are in it, etc., so that you see that. And they made a sort of standard. Their idea is we should have a standardized way of reporting what is in a data set, right? Of course, it's a very ambitious project and we don't have any type of like unification that way. But that to me is something that really tackles this problem. Like, do we know what's in our data set, what's being represented, what's not represented, what data is missing? That to me is where some of the biggest ethical challenges are arising from, is that how we then choose to apply those data sets becomes skewed.
So Wolfgang, I know that you're keen to share screen and put some examples and ask some questions. Just a question before we actually do that. Data being used for organizations, companies to profit. Is it that, so, and again, I think it comes back to this trust, authenticity, and it's not that we collect data intentionally to go out and make a profit, but how do you see the combination? And there's also another part to this question as well, because we are now a global business, if you like. There's business being transacted all around the globe. We have, as you mentioned, GDPR earlier, Alix, we've got all these different rules in different countries, and it's really hard to, when you are part of a global organization, to make sure that you're obeying all the rules in all the different places, or not hard, but you need to very much delve deeply into how you do that. How do companies and non-for-profits and governments and organizations, how can they position themselves to use data in order to make a profit, in order to serve their communities? So Wolfgang, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, for me, this is, I know there's various debates. I don't see the dichotomy as extreme, right? It's good if companies make profit. The opposite is worse. We don't want to get them bankrupt. We want to make them profit in an ethical way. I think on balance, things are improving for various reasons. And Singularity has had many talks and presentations around that. As I mentioned at the very beginning, I think we still have a huge gap in actually making use of what we have, and not just in this more commercial example that I made, but also in the poorest places that SU also cares a lot about, because there is the problem in the Central African Republic is not privacy. The problem in the Central African Republic is there's no data. Nobody has any clue what's happening. There's a lot of other problems. But so if there's somebody who can find out a cheap, nice way to create data models for the Central African Republic, then maybe many international partners that want to help that country could do a better job. But there's good news, because You can use geospatial data. You can use often in combination with existing data, which is not perfect, but you can get some imperfect estimates that can people play with. Again, how many people, how old are they, when do they die, how many kids are born, how many kids are born with assistant birth. But then you need to put on what Alix outlined and others to say, is this really the right number? Is this a bias? Can be correct for the bias to get the real number? That's for me another challenge in the field, that is because of the almost perfection in these super sampling and algorithm, people not only don't see the big picture, but actually forget there's a lot of other people that are out there. And you need, and I think it's better to be perfect in this wrong sample than to be imperfect in the right scope. And that's a bit what I'm arguing for. It's always good to say, how many people are we actually talking about? How old are they? What are they doing? And there is a number, because it has to add up to 7.9 billion. It has up to, I think, 35 million in Australia. So that number, we can always have that adding up constraint. But for me, there's still a lot of data that needs to be, I'm not sure if it's collected, but made sense of, especially in the poorest countries. There's good news there, but that's what I would put my focus on first.
It is very much access in education, as we've spoken about earlier. Alix, what are your thoughts? Data, profit, access?
Well, I think I don't disagree that there's an opportunity in the world that we live in to make a profit with our data. I think what we're seeing currently is a nefarious running rampant of business models that predicate on people's and prey rather on people's data, right? I think that I think there's opportunities to do it right. I think we have a plethora of examples where this is not currently being done right, where people are unknowingly and unwittingly giving up massive heaps of their data because the way in which it's extracted from them is just from like an individual level perspective is purposefully obscured. And that to me shows that there's a massive industry that has an interest in keeping that collection as opaque as possible. So I think there, like Wolfgang said, there's many opportunities where we can be responsible. And this is to me the story of any exponential technology, right? Is the whole notion of things becoming easier to make, cheaper to make, more democratically accessible. It means that we have to be more responsible with it. We have to be thoughtful of how we apply it. I think in the case of data, we see many examples of that not being done thoughtfully, not being done responsibly, and actually being used to oppress and to extract labor, wealth, and power from those that aren't in a position to fight back.
And it all comes down to the human in the end, doesn't it? Wolfgang, I know that you want to share screen. Would you like to? You still keen to do that?
Sure, I'm happy to do 2 things. Also, the audience should get ready because I want to do a quiz, and also just the nice thing is with data is sometimes you see surprises, right? Sometimes we think we know stuff, but then this is the more fun thing both of you referred to, and hey, Harley as well. I'll do this first, Christina, with you. If you tell me your birthday, I'll tell you how long you live. So yeah, tell me your birthday, Christina. You're muted.
Of course I am. 18th of September, 1973.
Okay, very nice, female. Good. So that's a simple, just to explain to the audience, simple way to think about yourself. You have one distinct position in the world because nobody else is born in the millisecond you're born, and that is modeled here. And Christina is position 5.8 billion, 5 billion, 802 million. And obviously the number moves up every second. We have to be aware as babies are born. And yeah, this first page is not that encouraging because we're always older than we think, but there's still 2 billion people older than Christina. And in Australia, it looks a bit better. So you're still in that 13. It's actually interesting in this peak here. Again, these are things, I'm not sure if you Australians knew, but there is these waves here of basically fertility and that again translate into 2-3 decades later. So that itself has something that you see quickly. But the page that's most liked and that Bill Gates also used and others is this one here. If there's a lot of red, it's good because the red countries are worse than Australia. This is the expected, again, don't be superstitious. This is the number. So 17th of September, 2063. if Christina was an average Australian, which is not, with average healthcare and average health behavior and projecting current trends, then it's another year Christina would live 80 years, and it would be September 17, 1963. There is a few countries where it's better, not where Alix lives or I live. So let's check how this compares with Holland. So that's, yeah, wow, 2 years longer in Australia. So that's for you.
Wow.
However, France is, again, way better than Holland. And again, this is a lot of the nice thing with those things is I don't have the answers, but I have new questions. So maybe you guys have the answers. It can be France, exceptional healthcare. It can be the weather, which I know is also good in Australia. But then Japan is the best. This is actually, I think, Japan or Korea. Yeah, Japan and Korea neck and neck. Sometimes you forget Korea, even Chile is quite good. So all of those surprises you find here, and Chile is way better than Australia. So again, a question to find out. Could also be a data error. I doubt it though. But yeah, but the good news, maybe a final news is here, you're better than New Zealand. So they have a year shorter, which again, should warrant some research. Why are females in your age group living shorter in New Zealand? Good. So then if it's okay, I have a second question. Do you see the world map now?
Yes.
Yeah, Christina. Good. So Holly, just get ready, but I'll introduce it. So basically, it's for the audience. You know, what is the singularity most important number, right? Just what's the one number? And I guess the number is 1 billion, right? As you talked a lot about 1 billion or the next billion, and you want to reach 1 billion people. So let's find out how big is the consumer class. I'm happy to go through the definitions, but it's basically everybody who can afford a bicycle, a motorcycle, and eat out. So it should be almost everybody in Australia. It's not everybody in the world, but it's 4.1 billion people in the world now. That's my team's projection, 4.1 billion. Question is, how will this change the next till the end of the decade, till 2030? And the world is still expected to get better, especially in some regions, and it's actually exactly 1 billion more, 1 billion extra consumers. It will all be, you know, sharing that data, and then others will make some use of it in a good way or not so good way. So 1 billion people extra that we'll have in 8 years, so not so long from now. Question to you, where are these people? Where are these people? And Holly, do you want to put the survey up? And the others can come in too. Christina, what do you think Asia and Africa? What's the number? It has to add up. The whole world has to add up to 1 billion extra people.
Okay, so I think Asia will be, see, I think there's a population decline happening. I'm just trying to use all the information that I've been reading over the last little while. So let me say
consumer class, yeah?
Okay,
so, yeah,
consumer
not all
class.
Asians, but the consumer class.
Okay, I would go, where am I? Asia and
Africa.
Africa and others. Let's make it simple.
I actually would go pretty much 50-50, I think.
Okay. Okay, good.
And just while there's a little pause, Alix, I know that you need to leave shortly. So I know that you're going to just fly off our screen. Thank you so much. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. So thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you so much. I'll dip out, but I really appreciate always talking to you and Wolfgang, and I love always seeing you at all. So thank you both.
Same here. We'll meet in Holland next week. I'll send you a note.
Nice. Is that for me too? I'll come over. Gladly come over.
Please do. Please come hang out.
It's so nice. So Wolfgang, put me out of my misery. What's the answer?
No, the number is actually it's a bit extreme number. That's why I wanted to do it. So people are mostly wrong. 800 million in Asia.
Wow.
This is not Africa's decade, unfortunately. It hopefully will be next one. 100 million in Africa, which is quite good, you know, compared to what's now, and 100 million rest of the world. The country answer is India. India has a huge, many people close to the threshold. And then again, as we did before, still people being born, and those are being born have a higher likelihood to be in the consumer class, that some of them that die. And that itself obviously adds. And then it's not just about the babies, because babies are not being added, as you said, but then as people are 17 years old, then become adults. So all of that dynamic movement you get. And we recently brought also a piece about the 5 markets under the radar, which is Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And despite the challenges in these countries, some of the long-term effect, you mentioned education, it's not perfect, but it's better than a generation before, have the effect, and then now play out in this broader trend lines.
Can I ask you, Wolfgang, like you collect so much, just for population.io, there's so much data collected. How do you manage that? Where does it filter in from? How does it get transferred up? Because the numbers, we watch the numbers on that page constantly changing. How do you manage all of that?
Well, I think that if you could say that the trick or the insight is you can create estimates. Some call it then algorithms, right? You know how many people are being born in Australia. You don't know if somebody's born exactly in the second, but it doesn't really matter. It is that you have the right feel for proportions, which again comes back to the Africa-Asia example. And so with clever statistics, you can compensate for some of this. Now, there is still then new numbers, right? We have obviously big global events happening and problematic events. So then you need to use a new estimate, and then until it's good enough, it's like your navigator when you're gonna back to, say, to Canberra or to Sydney. It's not always right, but it's still good to have that estimate. And then when you get new data in, then you calibrate and make it better. So, but maybe to directly answer the question, there is in the end is a rather big team in World Data Lab now, like 20 data scientists that are quite familiar. And on top of these, the releases of data, for example, the IMF will release new data in the next few days, but also then the specific country cases. And obviously, the big countries and the emerging markets, some of them you have better data than others. And so that's why then you get some other elements, but there's still a big machine behind in the back to calibrate it and make it better continuously.
So can I ask you also, because I know you everything you do is to create something better for other people, that trust and transparency is all there. How do you ensure, or how do you select, not ensure, how do you select the areas, the fields that you want to contribute to? So population.io contributes to so many different fields, population growth, estimates about where people are going to be, et cetera, economics, a multiplicity of information that we can get. How do you select how you want to contribute to that world of improvement, to affecting positively 1 billion lives in the next 10 years, to using data for good?
Thanks for this, Christina. So there's three elements. First, obviously, you need to have what's the topic of this combination of private and public. The math underneath modeling the poor is the same mathematics as modeling the middle class and the rich. And you can have dual use in the sense that, you do for the SDGs or for international institutions, you model the poor, and for commercials, you model the middle class, but still it's the same rigor and it's the same quality and credibility that's underneath this data model. And it's similar to, other examples like mobile money in Kenya. And I started the session with that, was founded actually with a grant from an international organization, from DFID, from the Brits, but then they converted this into something way better and way different and much more commercial. That's actually much more impactful than the non-profit side. So I don't see that also, that the dichotomy between actually often companies are actually the best players to make a good difference. But then there's the two other responses. One is obviously the SDGs give a very nice framework, and my co-founder of World Data Lab is actually the architect of the SDGs, so he knows quite a lot about it. And we are not experts in water or in climate, but we are experts in data, and we can use the approaches that we have developed to work with those experts to then do a population IO for climate, which we are now trying to build actually for the German G7 presidency. And the last and third part is that you go deeper, right? We know now how many people are in the world. We know now how many in the consumer class. We know how many in Australia. We know how many old in Australia, but I don't know how many old in Sydney, old rich people or old poor people in Sydney. And that is the next level, and that would improve the data. And when you go into Sydney data, then you have a neighborhood. And that's again comes back to this village leader discussion we had. And you don't necessarily need a village leader for this, but the concept that everybody can be part of it, because with 7.9 billion people, everybody has to be small part of it. But once you have something else you can make better, it's like a blurry puzzle, then you make that better in that segment. And that's a bit the approach. You go deep geographically and you go across the SDGs.
I love that. And I love the work that you do. It's remarkable how the difference that it can make. How is data being used at the moment? We're in a multiplicity of crises around the world. We've got pandemics and we've got, wars that are just absolutely tragic. We've got climate change that is affecting particularly not only us in Australia, but right now we've got floods and we've got certain regions that are about to get flooded for the third time in a 1 in 500 year estimate of a flood. How is data being used to assist, to help in these crises, or even, how is it being used full stop across some of these crises? I know that's a very multiple pronged question, but I don't know. How's it being used?
No, it's and first, I think again, it has been used much more than it has ever been used, and we started before on COVID, right? And this is again a nice anecdote people might remember, and may have been the same in Australia when put on the German news in April 2020. What was the headline? The headline was Johns Hopkins University estimates there's 3,000 cases of COVID. And you wonder, why is Johns Hopkins University doing that actually? And well, they were the only ones who had some estimate, which was absurd. Now, actually, there's a German system behind, and they have an estimate. And these estimates, they used to be bad because they didn't count on the weekends properly, but at least they put them out. People can say it's not a good estimate. So then it got better. And now we have a whole science behind this. But I think they've forgotten that 3 years ago, there was nothing like that. Now we have it. Now, it's not good to have it just for COVID. Why don't we have the data in real time for cancer and for heart disease, which are the two biggest, but also diarrhea and malaria and car accidents? There's a lot of other things that one could use now from this COVID example that then I think are helping us and reminding us there is ways to, again, communicate to the public in an aggregated way, communicate to a local public in a disaggregated way, and then use the underneath elements of the data to use for many other purposes. And often we don't know what these purposes are, right? I had no idea how population IO takes off when we started it, and there's lots of new ideas that come out with that. So that agnosticness we should have as well. And then I think the same would go for climate, and that maybe I close with that because that's a more nice illustration for your group too. Because the analogy, and obviously climate is also an SDG in that sense, has some relevance, but it has much more because that global attention. But the concept is the same, like with poverty. What's the concept? There's a big number, should go down to zero. What's the big number? It's 50 gigatons. That's what we pollute the planet every year. What is 50 gigatons? It's 100,000 tons per minute, 100,000 tons per minute. So that you can grasp. How much is that for you, Christina? I think Australia is actually pretty bad. I think you're around 20 tons as an Australian. Germany is 10. US is also 20. The world average is 6. So that's 6 tons per person. Now, what are these tons coming from? So some much is transport, some is energy, some is chemicals, some is cement. But you hear me talk about cement and chemicals. Everybody talks about airplanes, but cement and chemicals are actually more important than airplanes or ships. So again, I could talk a bit more about this, but it gives you a sense, actually even climate important to get these numbers right, and then the projections. We should also ask ourselves, is Australia going to pollute less or more in the next few years? And often we don't know these answers. So once we have that, a bit like with health, then we can be more precise. We can say, okay, Australia's main problem is maybe in coal. I don't know. Maybe it's in transport, but is it cars or trucks? Or maybe it's in the chemical industry. So let's just get the numbers, and then we can see how we solve it. Otherwise, it's okay. Climate crisis. Let's bring the world to an end because we don't know what to do. But yeah, you need the numbers, and then some things are more difficult, and some things are easier. Some countries are doing better, some not. And so for that, I will next time I'll see you. Hopefully, I can present that climate machine to you.
I would love that, actually. If we could, I'd love to have you back to present definitely that, because I think the more people realize the numbers, and then so for me, it's a numbers thing. When you say 20, I sit here and I'm totally ashamed that the country that I come from has such a high output in something that we really should be working toward net zero. Anyway, we have an election coming up. Let's just hope that becomes a part of that election promise. But I think for me, it's hearing that number and then actually transferring it into actions that we can take. And that's what I love about population.io. There's all these numbers, but it's also related to diet and to location and to socioeconomic. So you kind of then are able to put the whole picture together. And I love that about what you do. So thank you so much. And I would love to have you back very soon to further unpack that. Possibly before the election in Australia might be a really good point of time to do that. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I'm going to ask you one final question. If you had words of wisdom around data and how people should be reading it, using it, looking at it, contributing to it, what would those words of wisdom be?
Okay. Don't be scared. It's take it, but always question in the sense of zooming out to say, what are they saying? Is this now real or not? Is really old age poverty going up in Australia, or is it an special story? Again, on this one I can report back, but
I think it is. I think you're right.
Don't be scared for it, but then again, think of the numbers it relates to.
Wolfgang, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. There is so much more to unpack, as you say, and love to have you back very soon. So we'll be in touch to organise
so
a
great
date.
to see you. All the best to the Australia, or everybody in Australia and the ESU community. You're doing a great job there. Thank you.
Thank you. If you've enjoyed this webinar, please share it with your colleagues and your friends. You can access it beyond today as well. So we'll be in touch very shortly. Stay safe, stay well, and as you go forward in your daily lives, please love unconditionally.